about states' rights and the national bank. And really, one of the first things that we need to touch on is the idea about sectionalism. Okay, sectionalism. It's something that really does exist today. It's just a little bit different than it was at this time. Okay, as you recall, we're coming out of the era of good feelings, where a sense of national pride emerges. People are proud to say they're from America. It comes out during the era of James Monroe. But once America starts to make some policies that begin to affect different parts of the country differently, you begin to see tensions arise. And those tensions emerge between the different parts of our country. At this time, it was predominantly North versus South. Today's sectionalism kind of exists between urban communities and rural communities. So, but nevertheless, that is still a type of sectionalism. Now, this sectionalism arises, this hate, not really a hatred, but dislike for one another and locating yourself in pride in your own region, has to do with some things that the government was doing, okay? One of such of those things was a national tariff. It was a tariff, okay? Now, this was the tariff that was created back in 1816. And what is a tariff? What is any tariff? A tax on what kind of goods? Imported goods. And so who pays this tax directly? It's a tax on who? If it's a tax on imported goods, it's a tax on other countries. Okay? And the money that is collected from those taxes goes toward the government. So how is it protective? How does a tariff, what is it protecting and how is it protective? All right, I'll get Sophie. That's absolutely correct. Sophie gave us an excellent definition. I'm going to give you an example, okay? Now, this is not really the most practical example, but it'll help you to understand what Sophie said. So let's say that, America makes nice cars. And one of the cars that America makes is a Cadillac. Okay, it's an American-made car. And also, the Japanese, they make nice cars as well. And they make cars called Lexus, which are also nice luxury cars. The Japanese are able to make their cars a little more inexpensively for whatever reasons. And so they want to sell their cars in the United States. And you can get a fully loaded, nicely made Lexus car made by the Japanese, and they can make it for $60,000. Well, the Americans make the Cadillac, but it costs them $70,000 to make it. So the United States might put a tariff on the Japanese automakers to increase the price of the Lexus so that it's more competitive with the American-made automobile, to compete with them, and it protects our American automobile industry. Does that make sense? Because that tariff is going to, the Japanese are like, well, I want to sell my cars here, but I still want to make as much money. And so I'm going to increase the cost of my car to pay that tariff. And so it's a tax on foreign companies to protect American industry. Does that make sense? Now, when this was created, there were no automobiles. This was like 1816, okay? But what the tariff is on, it's a tariff that protects American industry. What part of the United States had industry? The North. There was not much of any manufacturing at all in the South, because what was the economy of the South based upon? Agriculture, slavery, okay? So the people of, so all these manufactured goods coming into the United States that have this tariff on them, does the South still want to purchase manufactured goods? Do people in the South want to purchase manufactured goods like clothes and stuff like? Yeah. Their goods are going to be more expensive. What benefit is the South receiving from the tariff? What protections are they getting? None. So they're having to foot the bill for the imported goods tariff, but they're not getting any benefit. Do you see why they're upset by this? And so they refer to it as the tariff of abominations. It's not really the tariff of abominations. That's just what it's called. It's actually the tariff of 1816 is what it's called. Okay? So this tariff of abominations was disgusting and loathsome and almost like a punishment to the South. Well, it benefited the North. Do you see why that would create sectional tension and opposition? Do you see? Can you understand that? Okay. All right, so obviously you're going to see a lot of opposition to this tariff in the form of from Southern legislators. And a man by the name of John C. Calhoun, whom you see right there. You ever heard of Calhoun County, West Virginia? It's named after John C. Calhoun. He was a South Carolinian. He's not from West Virginia, guys, sorry. But he's from South Carolina, and he devised a theory on how to oppose this tariff. And he calls it the theory of nullification, or nullification theory. Basically, what he's going to do is he's going to question the legality of applying some federal laws to certain states, in particularly his state. He believes that the state has the right that if they feel like the federal government is trampling upon them, that state can reject or nullify certain things the federal government does if they feel it unfair. Okay? So he's trying to use a constitutional argument. He's like, this federal law is unconstitutional. This tariff is unfair, it's unconstitutional, and our state rejects it. And he believes that any state should have the ability to do this. Because he feels like the federal government might trample on the rights of the states. And if the federal government refuses to agree with him on this, then that state has the right to withdraw from the Union, to secede, to say we're no longer part of America. This is the 1820s when this is happening. This is 40 years before the Civil War breaks out. South Carolina was already threatening secession. So secession is not a new idea. Okay? So, South Carolina, what does the federal government give in and say, okay, South Carolina, you don't have to pay this tariff. You're right, no. And so South Carolina rebels. And in 1832, South Carolina found, they said this, we declare this tariff as unlawful, and so therefore it is null and void and not a law that we're obeying. Now Mr. Moore? Okay. I'll let you sign that. So, at the time, the President of the United States is Andrew Jackson. He was the President of the United States at the time when South Carolina rebelled. And this guy, John C. Calhoun, do you know what his office was? He was Vice President of the United States. And he's leading up this rebellion where he's encouraging a state to withdraw from the Union. The Vice President. So you think we're going through tough times now? Imagine what it was like then. Andrew Jackson is furious. He was absolutely irate about this idea. And so, even though Andrew Jackson himself is a Southerner, is a slave owner even, he can sympathize with what the South is going through, but he's like, I'll be danged if one of my states secedes from the Union over this. And so basically he threatens to march federal troops into South Carolina to enforce the tariff, basically declaring martial law and taking the state over by military force. He even convinces Congress to make that action legal by by asking them to pass what's known as the Force Bill, which allowed the federal government to use the Army and Navy against South Carolina, its own state, for not paying its proper duties. So it's not looking good because John C. Calhoun's not backing down. Andrew Jackson's he's getting approval to march the Army and Navy into one of our sovereign states to take it over by force. Things are coming to getting ready to become to a violent head. And that's where we enter the great compromiser. Who's the great compromiser? Comes up with all the compromisers. He's the face of your Schoology right now. Henry Clay. Henry Clay intercedes, and even though a bloody confrontation seemed inevitable, Henry Clay steps in and proposed to lower the tariff over a 10-year period. So, yeah, it's not going to be great at first, South Carolina, but you know what? You hang in there in 10 years, it'll be back down to normal. So, Henry Clay steps in, compromises so that both sides can try to avoid the crisis between states' rights and the federal government. That's what this is all about. Who has the authority? The states or the federal government? And this is a question that still goes on today over federalism. Whose power should reign supreme? In almost all cases, it's the federal government because the Constitution has the supremacy clause. However, South Carolina felt that it was being treated unfairly and unconstitutionally, and we are bound to follow the Constitution. And that's why this was such a contentious time period. Okay? Questions on, that's called the nullification crisis or nullification theory. Questions on that? All right, moving on. Andrew Jackson is an interesting president. And he's the president that absolutely despised the Bank of the United States, which is kind of funny because he's on the $20 bill. The guy who despised the bank, they put on the money. Kind of ironic. Do you guys know what ironic means? Okay. All right, so Andrew Jackson never has to resort to sending the troops to South Carolina, but he does wage a very personal war on the Bank of the United States of America. All right? In fact, during the same year that he dealt with South Carolina in 1832, the charter for the original Bank of the United States is set to get re-upped, all right, because it expired. Congress re-ups it, and then he vetoes it. He actually prevents the bank from being rechartered. So he's kind of on the attack. He actively is attacking. Andrew Jackson uses his veto power more than any other president before him combined. Okay? He was definitely, totally wanted to exercise his executive authority. All right, so Andrew Jackson, it was an election year in at this time period, and Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, two famous American legislators, wanted to make the idea of a bank and having the bank and rechartering the bank a federal election issue. All right? They thought that Andrew Jackson would veto it, which he does, and in doing so, he would lose support. And he would lose support, but he would lose support amongst people that have money, wealthy people. Are there more wealthy people in the United States, or are there more poor farmers? Poor farmers. Okay, it's just like today. Are there more millionaires, or are there more middle-class people like me? Middle-class people like me. So, in doing so, but they underestimated that fact. They underestimated the public's dislike and distrust of the Bank of the United States, as well as Andrew Jackson's political skills. So, Andrew Jackson and his allies made certain that the public came to think of the Bank of the United States, the BUS, Bank of the United States, as a privileged, elitist institution. That if you had any association with it, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth and you were uppity and you turned your nose up like you're an elite, wealthy person. And he tried to paint it that way. So Jacksonians, but in doing this, all of our federal tax revenues at this time were deposited in the Bank of the United States. So every dollar that the United States government earned from the tariff or taxes or excise taxes all went to the bank, not state banks, not private banks. So it definitely had an unfair advantage over other banks because of the massive amount of money that it held. All right? So, and not your average American taxpayer was going to earn any money from the deposits that the bank was holding. Only wealthy, elite people. So the bank president, whose name was Nicholas Biddle, was actually one of the most powerful men in the United States. And he's just the president of a bank. He's not elected by anybody, but he controlled the money. He had access and control of a lot of the money floating around in America. And Andrew Jackson wanted to kill this bank. He wanted it to be done with. He wanted it to be gone. He wanted to destroy it. So Andrew Jackson ends up winning the 1836 election and totally vetoes the renewal charter of the Bank of the United States. He then appoints a Secretary of Treasury who was willing to place all the government funds, all the money that was in the Bank of the United States has to go somewhere. And he puts it in these things called pet banks, which are state banks. All right? We refer to them as pet banks, though. They're called pet banks because they were loyal to Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. They were his pets. So, the Bank of the United States loses most of its money and then just becomes like any other bank because all the federal deposits are no longer going to it. And basically, Andrew Jackson forces the hand of Nicholas Biddle and makes him begin to accept loans or to give loans and accept deposits from poor people, from farmers who want to try to get ahead. And so when he begins to have, in order to do that, he has to provide a little bit more competitive loan rates, something that will help the average person. And so when that begins to happen, the Second Bank of the United States just becomes another bank, a local bank in Philadelphia. Even though it was still called the Second Bank of the United States, it was just a regular old local bank in Philadelphia. Eventually, it goes out of business, and Nicholas Biddle is, I'm not going to say he's penniless, but Andrew Jackson really does destroy the banking industry. So Jackson's tactics and policies regarding all of this angers a lot of people. It angers people like Henry Clay. Henry Clay came up with the American system. And one of the things the American system does is wants to create infrastructure and wants for people to be able to expand into the West. And if they don't have any access to money to do this through the banking system, they can't. And so they completely and entirely form a brand new political party called the Whigs, the Whig Party. Now, it's not because they wore funny hairpieces. That's not why it's called the Whigs. It actually comes from the American Revolution. There was a political party in England during the American Revolution that was like, hey, they were British people, and in Parliament they would be like, hey, King, all those Americans are right. You're an evil tyrant. And so the Whig Party borrows that, and they attack Andrew Jackson with it. Andrew Jackson, you're an evil tyrant. So they apply it to him. They even call him King Andrew I. So the Whig Party entirely forms out of the frustrations that some people felt from Andrew Jackson. So they were created to oppose the Democratic Party. So Whigs backed ideals of the American system, The ideas of Henry Clay. They wanted to use federal money to construct roads and canals, the infrastructure. They also wanted a federal control of the banking system and a nationally accepted currency. Those are the ideas of the Whig Party. Okay? So, Andrew Jackson announces he's not going to run for a third term, which was not the law then, he could have. And the Democratic Party chose his vice president, Martin Van Buren, MVB. Martin Van Buren. I like to call him Martin Van Ruin because things went bad during his presidency. He is remembered as a president of consequence. He inherited a lot of bad stuff. I mean, let's be honest, our financial system was in the tubes after our president completely tanked the banking system. Andrew Jackson had just recently moved several thousand Native Americans from their home across the Mississippi River at the gunpoint of the United States Army. South Carolina had just threatened secession. Things were not going good in America. And so Martin Van Buren's got his hands full. He's got his hands full. And the legacy that Andrew Jackson leaves was not exactly the most pure and the best for Martin Van Buren. One of the things that he has to deal with is a panic. It's a total, like a bank run, a panic. Banks begin to close. Banks begin to collapse. Many people lost their savings, life savings. Hundreds of businesses bankrupt. And about 1/3 of the population of the United States was out of work. Unemployment, extremely high. That happened. It's called the Panic of 1837. It happens during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, right at the beginning. So, in order to try to stop this panic, banks begin to issue notes called specie. Specie, S-P-E-C-I-E, specie. And specie was basically just like, we're going to do away with paper money and go back on the gold and silver. That's what specie was. Well, if you go from having paper money to precious metal currency overnight, it's going to cause massive inflation or deflation, depending upon where you were, what the price of things were. So, Martin, what is it?
How does that?
All right, because your paper money is like, all right. What is this? $50. $50 bill. How much is it worth?
$50.
Why do you believe? Who says this is worth $50? Do we just collectively agree that this is worth $50?
Yeah.
So, I mean, is there anything that backs this up? Is there like gold somewhere that backs it up? No. It's the Federal Reserve of the United States of America says this has value. And we actually all do agree that this has value because we believe in that Federal Reserve System. Now, 150 years ago, if I had a $50 bill, it would not say Federal Reserve note on it. It would say gold standard or silver standard. And I could take that piece of paper and I could take it to a bank and I could give it to them and they would weigh out $50 worth of gold or $50 worth of silver and give it to me. Because that's how our money used to be based on. And when we switch here using specie, meaning no more this, and we're only going to use gold and silver, well, the value of the gold and silver is obviously more than a piece of paper. And so it caused problems because not everybody had, there was way more of this than there was of gold and silver. Was everybody able to go turn their paper in for gold and silver? No, because there just wasn't enough. And when everybody goes to the bank to try to say, okay, I have $50, give me $50 gold and silver, and the bank says, sorry, I've given all the gold and silver out I have, this is worthless. It becomes worthless because it was no longer on that standard. Okay? So you can see how this caused big problems and how a national federal banking institution was needed. All right? At least that was the opinion by many. Okay? So, needless to say, Van Buren's got his hands full and his presidency kind of ends poorly. He's a one-term president because things were so bad during his presidency. Usually a presidents that serve only one term, things are either handed to them bad at the beginning or they do a really terrible job as president. Okay? So, just historically. All right? So, he has to be defeated when he runs, and he's defeated by a man by the name of William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison ran against Martin Van Buren. William Henry Harrison was a Whig Party candidate, so he is a member of the Whig Party. So they're pretty quick into their formation. They're already winning elections, presidential ones. And do you guys remember us ever discussing or talking about William Henry Harrison in the past? His nickname's Old Tippecanoe. Where did he get that nickname? From the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he defeated Indians in the areas of present-day Ohio and Indiana, where he became a political leader and war hero during the War of 1812. So he's a war hero, and he's painted as a man of the people. And, Martin Van Buren was kind of painted as, like, not a man of the people, as a pampered, privileged aristocrat. When in all actuality, Martin Van Buren was probably more of a common man than William Henry Harrison. Martin Van Buren's like the son of a guy that owned a bar, a tavern owner. He never really earned much money, while Harrison, on the other hand, was from a wealthy family that lived in a mansion. So, but Harrison immediately took the steps to enact the Whig program and try to overcome the depression that had gripped the United States from the Panic of 1837. But on his inauguration day, it was a cold, windy, rainy January day, and Harrison, being the big, powerful war hero, said, "I'm not wearing a hat, I'm not wearing a coat." And he gives the longest inaugural speech in the history of America. It was 8,400 words. And then he catches pneumonia and dies a month later, leaving his vice president, John Tyler, who becomes known as His Excellency. Like, you say Your Majesty to a king, Your Excellency, to John Tyler, who was kind of an afterthought. He was only chosen because he's from Virginia. Virginia had a lot of electoral votes. He didn't even really agree with a lot of the policies of the Whig Party. But it was a total political move to be chosen. And, he becomes the successor. And he opposed a lot of the Whig Party's program and for economic recovery. So the Whigs had put them on there to pick up Southern votes, given that he is a Virginia man. And they never thought he would really play much of a role in government. They were just going to stick him in there vice president and forget about him and let William Henry Harrison do all the real work. But Harrison dies. So during the next 4 years, they would see that his inclusion, the Whig Party would see his inclusion on the ticket as a pretty big mistake. And that's where they began to call him His Excellency. Questions? Lots going on in America, even from the 1840s. Okay, you guys watching at home, if you have questions, you can message me on Schoology.